Beginning in 1492, European powers established a global system of transatlantic resource extraction. For centuries, imperial wealth was built through the appropriation of precious metals and agricultural commodities like tobacco and sugar from the New World. By the 18th century, these multi-century territorial claims culminated in intense geopolitical friction, ultimately erupting into the 7 Years' War, a global conflict between the French and British empires. This chart shows the British balance sheet following the war. Protecting the colonies came at a staggering cost. The empire was burdened with a deficit of £60 million. To service this debt, Parliament abandoned colonial autonomy, shifting toward direct fiscal extraction. The conflict emerged from the specific fiscal constraints of the 1760s, the mathematical result of an over-leveraged empire attempting to balance its books by taxing a population accustomed to local autonomy. That £60 million shortfall served as the mechanical engine driving both the Crown and the colonies toward an unavoidable fracture. The first phase of this imperial escalation was the 1764 Sugar Act. This legislation mandated that the colonies import sugar and molasses exclusively from British suppliers, while exacting strict duties on every shipment. A year later, Parliament introduced the 1765 Stamp Act to generate daily revenue directly from the colonies. Routine paperwork was bottlenecked. Property deeds, pamphlets, and playing cards required a mandatory 2 to 3 pence British stamp to be legally valid. This diagram outlines the colonial counter-strategy. Americans organized widespread boycotts of imported goods, causing a sharp drop in British revenue. By weaponizing market forces, colonists inflicted immediate economic damage, forcing Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. However, because the colonists lacked representatives in the Parliament levying these duties, the dispute over fiscal policy mutated into a volatile question of sovereignty. Parliament responded with the 1766 Declaratory Act, asserting absolute authority to govern the colonies, and followed it by imposing targeted import duties on glass, lead, paper, tea, and oil. The British monarchy demanded total compliance. King George III and his government refused to moderate their sovereign control in response to the economic resistance. When colonial boycotts resumed, Britain abandoned purely financial pressure. They deployed 1,000 combat troops to occupy Boston and forced locals to fund their presence. This military presence rapidly escalated urban tensions. On March 5th, a local dispute outside the customs house intensified as a crowd began hurling snowballs and rocks at an outnumbered British Guard detail. The confrontation ended with an undisciplined volley of British gunfire that killed 5 civilians. The Patriot press immediately weaponized the incident, distributing accounts of the Boston Massacre throughout the colonies. Colonial retaliation was highly organized. In Boston Harbor, the Sons of Liberty boarded a British ship and destroyed £10,000 sterling worth of imported tea to protest the remaining duties. The Crown responded with overwhelming punitive measures. They revoked the Massachusetts Charter, imposed direct military rule over the city, and dispatched an additional 3,000 troops. Deploying an occupying force to enforce a failed economic policy rapidly accelerates radicalization and sparks urban insurgency. Recognizing the threat of military rule, 56 delegates from 12 colonies convened in Philadelphia. This First Continental Congress centralized the rebel command structure for the first time. In Massachusetts, General Gage deployed 700 troops from Boston to seize rebel weapons in Concord. The forces collided at Lexington, initiating armed conflict. As the British retreated, Minutemen swarmed the route, trapping the expeditionary force back inside Boston. A highly mobile, decentralized network of armed locals utilizing geographic intelligence can effectively neutralize a professional military force. The British attempted to break the resulting siege at the Battle of Bunker Hill. As this elevation map shows, while the British technically took the high ground, the entrenched militia inflicted nearly 1,000 casualties on the Redcoats. Realizing the necessity of a structured military response, Congress formally established the Continental Army and appointed George Washington as its commander-in-chief. Concurrently, in upstate New York, a bloodless night raid led by Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen captured Fort Ticonderoga, securing a massive stockpile of heavy munitions. The challenge was moving those assets to the front line. Washington's forces executed a grueling logistical operation. Using oxen, they dragged 120,000 pounds of heavy artillery across 300 miles of frozen terrain over 2 months. Washington deployed these heavy guns to fortify Dorchester Heights under the cover of darkness. By dawn, the British positions in Boston were completely exposed, forcing the immediate evacuation of 11,000 personnel. The successful siege of Boston proved that mastering supply chains and long-distance logistics dictates the outcome of prolonged positional warfare. During this period, Thomas Paine published a widely distributed pamphlet called Common Sense. This text shifted the Overton window, moving the concept of total independence out of radical circles and into mainstream colonial thought. Congress formally codified the insurgency into a sovereign state in July of 1776, voting unanimously for independence. The British Empire answered this declaration of sovereignty with overwhelming conventional force, projecting an armada of 130 warships and 25,000 elite troops to Staten Island. Advancing on Brooklyn, the British leveraged superior training. They pinned the Continentals with a frontal decoy, while a massive flanking force swept around the American lines. Washington's forces collapsed under the sudden rear assault, finding themselves trapped between the British Army and the East River. Instead of an immediate final assault, the British dug in for a siege. This delay allowed a thick fog to set in overnight, giving Washington the cover necessary to secretly evacuate his surviving army across the river. What followed was a sequence of consecutive defeats. The Continentals were chased out of Manhattan and forced into a disorganized retreat through New Jersey and down into Pennsylvania. The Continental Army's survival in Pennsylvania shifted the conflict into a war of attrition. Winning now required outlasting the British Empire's geopolitical will and its ability to finance a global occupation.